functioning social system, and less wealth, because the growth simply will not be what it otherwise would have been. The irreducible functions of government have to do with three things: defense from outside threat, law enforcement, and a judicial system. So you have to have armed forces, you have to have police, and you have to have courts. Everything else has, and of course they have an economic cost too, but if they perform their functions properly, the economic benefits are much greater than the costs, because a society that operates under the rule of law, in which contracts are enforced, in which fraud is combated, in which corruption is combated effectively, is a society in the economic system of which will operate more effectively. Everything else that is done by the government has an economic cost, and the cost is greater than the benefit except for certain groups. I repeat that. Everything else besides these three core functions of government, everything else the government does in every area has a higher cost than benefit for a society as a whole. Although almost all of these measures will benefit certain groups in society. And as I pointed out before, the groups benefited will of course form a lobby to have these benefits maintained and increased. And since the benefit which they get is very large, and the cost to each one of the individual other citizens of the society is relatively small, their lobbies tend to be more effective. Okay. We're now going to discuss what we started very briefly last week, but didn't get very far, and that is international economics, and we're going to start with international trade. Again, remember what I said last week, which is that international trade is simply trade with an adjective. It's trade that goes on among and between countries. It has certain aspects which are different from domestic trade, but the principles are the same. All the principles we discussed, all the principles of exchange, all the principles of supply and demand apply internationally as well as domestically. There is something called the doctrine of comparative advantage in international trade. This is called a doctrine rather than a theory because it has been proven over and over again thousands, millions of times, both in theory and in practice. And that is that that even if a country can produce something at a lower cost than another country, if overall it produces at a higher cost than the other country, it still will be to its benefit to trade, to import those things from the other country and sell those things where it has a comparative advantage to the other country. This may seem counterintuitive. It does seem counterintuitive to a lot of people, but again, it has been proven over and over again through the centuries. It is a doctrine. It is. I don't think you'll find an economist who will argue about the doctrine of comparative advantage. Although the defenders of protectionism, that is, the defenders of violating the principles of free trade, the principles of exchange applied to international trade, can find reasons for their actions. One way of benefiting a domestic constituency, so for example, is to put a high tariff on foreign products that compete with the products that are produced in your country. Again, this obviously has a cost for everybody in the country that buys that product, but it very definitely benefits the producers of that product. Another excuse that's given for protectionism is called the infant industry argument, and that is used by developing countries primarily. They say, well, we can't, we're just beginning to manufacture, to produce certain things, and our producers can't compete with the great international producers of these things and so forth. We're going to put a tariff on foreign imports until our producers are large enough to have the same economies of scale, the same marginal benefits that the other countries have. The problem with that, of course, is that the domestic producers that are benefited by it are going to argue that they're always infants and that protectionism must go on forever. They may succeed in doing that, they may not succeed in doing that, but every country that has put protectionist tariffs on imports in order to protect infant industries has kept those tariffs on much longer than those industries needed actually to have that kind of protection. The only argument for protectionism that can be justified from the standpoint of politics is the national security aspect. We need to produce certain weapons systems, for example, even if we could buy them more inexpensively abroad from other countries, even if they were of similar or the same quality or even higher quality. We need to produce them because we cannot be dependent on other countries for this kind of product. That's an argument that has a reasonable justification. A country, talking now about a country with that has a substantial defense and security sector, a country cannot leave itself open to the possibility of another country refusing to supply it with the weapons of defense and security for the products that go into defense and security. So there is a reasonable argument for that. Beware, however, when the argument is applied to products and to industries which can't justify having that kind of continuing protection. International trade is regulated by two things. International trade is regulated, first of all, by agreements, treaties, and agreements among and between countries. These are of various kinds. There are, first of all, trade facilitation agreements. A trade facilitation agreement might, for example, cover customs procedures on both sides, try to simplify customs procedures. It might include items having to do with procurement, government procurement, where we will allow your industries to bid on our government procurement bids or needs, and of course you will reciprocate by letting our companies bid on your procurement needs, and so on. There are many different kinds of things that can be made smoother by trade facilitation agreements. You can have agreements on the reduction of tariffs. In other words, you can make an agreement with another country that you're going to reduce the tariffs on its products by 5% or 50% or whatever the figure it is, if they do the same thing with reference to your exports to them. The next step would be a free trade agreement where all or almost all products trade freely between the two countries or a group of countries. An example of that is the North American Free Trade Area between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Another example is the European Union. There is the South American Free Trade, it's called actually South American Common Market, or Mercosur. There are many free trade agreements around the world, and they have to do with eliminating tariffs on almost all products, as well as reducing, if not eliminating, what are called non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are impediments to international trade that are imposed by countries that are not tariffs. Tariffs, of course, are the same as taxes, but are applied to goods coming in from other countries. Non-tariff barrier, for example, would be a sanitary regulation or a phytosanitary regulation. Phytosanitary has to do with plants, sanitary has to do with animals. Another country has a problem with hoof and mouth disease, for example, with cattle. So the countries that don't have the problem will probably refuse to import any cattle or any beef products from that country as long as it has hoof and mouth disease. That's a sanitary measure. A particular country may have plant disease, widespread plant disease in its wheat crop. So other countries will put in phytosanitary measures to prevent that country from exporting its wheat to them until that matter is settled. Under a free trade agreement, aspects of non-tariff barriers may also be covered, and also it may cover all kinds of things that are covered in other kinds of trade agreements, such as government procurement, such as customs procedures, such as rules of origin. Rules of origin are very important. If you are eliminating your tariffs on another country, let's take a specific example. The United States has eliminated most, if not all, tariffs on goods coming in from Canada and Mexico. But these are supposed to be Canadian or Mexican goods, or goods produced by American companies in those countries. That's fine, or produced by foreign companies, but in those countries, not goods that are imported into those countries and then shipped by those countries into the United States. So you have rules of origin. In other words, X% of the value of a particular product must be actually manufactured, produced in that country. If you're importing something from Canada, for example, it will come in duty-free if the Canadian input to that product is of a certain level. The same thing is true of Mexico. The same thing is true of American products going to Mexico or to Canada, and so on. So rules of origin, which can be rather complex, will also be covered in free trade agreements. You move on, but in a free trade agreement, again, we can take the North American Free Trade Agreement among the United States, Canada, and Mexico as our example. Each one of those countries, all three of those countries, maintain their own policies of tariffs and non-tariff barriers with reference to third countries. In other words, Mexico will be perfectly free to apply whatever rules it wants to apply within the general rules of international trade, of course, with reference to its trade with Colombia, with reference to its trade with France, with Japan, with any other country in the world. The same thing is true of the United States, and the same thing is true of Canada. The next step would be a customs union. A customs union, which the North American Free Trade area is not, but the European Union is. A customs union means that trade barriers are eliminated, or mostly eliminated, among the countries of the customs union, but they also have a common policy of barriers to goods coming from outside the area of the customs union. If the North American Free Trade Area were a North American customs union, the United States, Canada, and Mexico would all have to have the same level of tariffs and the same non-tariff barriers against all other countries. Ours would be the same as Canada's, Canada's would be the same as Mexico, etc. Remember, that is not the case with the North American Free Trade Area. It is the case with, to a very large extent, with Mercosur. It is the case with the European Union and other customs unions around the world. The third step, and the most complete step in economic integration among countries, is called a common market. Now, you will recall the factors of production: land, labor, capital, and management. In a common market, you go beyond services and goods. You go beyond goods and services. All of the factors of production, with the exception, of course, of land, can freely move among the members of a common market. So, labor will have as much right to work in another country as it has to work in its own country. Management, the same thing. Capital, the same thing. Banks and other financial institutions can operate in all the countries of the common market as if they were operating in their own country. There would be no differentiation. This is a full integration of the economies of the countries involved, and the prime example of that in the world today is the European Union. Mercosur is supposed to be a common market. It isn't really. It never got to that stage, so that there's still lots and lots of exceptions to the rules that would otherwise apply if it were a true common market. There are big problems with common markets, as the European Union is discovering, and that is that it is very difficult to have an economic union without a political union. Just as it's very difficult to have a political union without an economic union, as the United States discovered when it moved from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, which was largely done because prior to that change, different states in the United States had different policies and interfered with trade and investment and movement of people among the different states. The same is true if you try to have a common economic market without having a political union. And this is being discovered now in Europe, because the different countries of Europe do not have the same domestic fiscal labor policies that with the other members of the Union. They don't have the same regulatory structure as the other members of the Union. They don't have the same tax structures as other members of the Union. And this is creating a situation whereby some member countries are in a very bad position with reference to other member countries, and the instruments of the European Union, the Commission and the Parliament, are tying themselves in knots, trying to get these countries to coordinate their domestic policies so that the economic common market can work. The problem is, of course, that directly affects the sovereignty of the countries involved. And therefore, there is a great deal of opposition to this. There is a great deal of problems that arise because of this, a great deal of controversy, a great deal of conflict. And we're living through that now in Europe. Basically, if a region of the world, which covers 3 countries or 8 countries or 20 countries, a region of the world wants to combine, as the 13 colonies combined, it has to eventually become a political as well as an economic union. It has to become a federal state, in effect. Europe would have to become a country in which France is a province, Great Britain is a province, Germany is a province, and so on and so forth. And ladies and gentlemen, that isn't going to happen. So the European Union is going through a major crisis at the present time, and it's a crisis that was avoidable simply by not going to that stage. In other words, staying at the stage of a common market, staying at the stage of a free trade area or of a customs union. Even a customs union has certain problems that a free trade area doesn't have. And if I were advising a 5-country area someplace that was thinking of free trade area versus customs union versus common market versus federal state, I would say if you want a federal state, that's fine. If the governments and the people of your 5 countries are comfortable with that, that's fine. Otherwise, leave it at the level of a free trade area. Going to a customs union, and even more so to a common market, simply will multiply your problems. And the international regulatory body for international trade, the worldwide regulatory body is the World Trade Organization, located in Geneva, Switzerland. We mentioned it last time. The World Trade Organization provides many functions. It has function of collecting statistics and doing analytical work. It has the function of providing a venue for countries to negotiate, and it has the very important function of adjudicating trade disputes among member countries. And as I mentioned before, there are panels of experts that can be drawn upon by the World Trade Organization. If 2 countries have a trade dispute, the panel will be convened. It will listen to the 2 sides. It will make its decision. If the country which loses wants to appeal the decision, it can do so, and then an appeals panel will be formed. The decision of the appeals panel is final on those countries that are members of the World Trade Organization and is supposed to be carried out. Now, if a country refuses to carry out the decision of an appeals panel of the World Trade Organization, the other country, the country that won the case, can take retaliatory measures by putting tariffs or putting prohibitions on the trade from the country that's refusing to follow the decision to the same value of the goods that otherwise it would have been able to send to that other country. So there is self-help element here, and the system works quite well. The WTO works well. The international trading